Daniel. Today I'm going to be talking about the history and development of the Soviet design and built Mikoyan, Goebel, and MiG-15. The MiG-15 is the most produced fighter jet in history, with anywhere from 12,000 to 15,000 in total being built. Not only was it the most produced, it also played with one of the longest running military service histories from 1949 well into the early 2000s. This is my first time doing a video of this type, so I hope you find it both entertaining and informative. After the collapse of Nazi Germany in the spring of 1945, the tensions between the East and West became more and more substantial, quickly causing the two sides to try and get an advantage over the other in any way possible. This included aviation, which had played a significant part in the outcome of the Second World War. When the United States entered their first jet fighter into service soon after the collapse of Nazi Germany, it was clear to the Soviet Union that unless they were able to get an aircraft of similar or superior performance into the air, they would quickly fall behind the West in terms of aviation power and capabilities. In 1946, almost 2 years after the first American jet fighters took to the air, the first Soviet jet fighters would finally fly. And it was almost immediately found out by the Soviet High Command that while they had similar performance to the American fighters, the planes were severely flawed. The major problem that contributed to this was that the only jet engines available to the Soviet Union at this time, at least in large quantities, were reverse-engineered German jet engines, which had never been quite perfected before the collapse of the nation. Realizing this, three very powerful Soviet engineers came up with the idea of using British jet engines instead of the now outdated German ones. After some persuasion and reluctance, Stalin would agree to let the three-man team go to the British to request examples of the Rolls-Royce RB-41 Mini jet engines, which at the time were the most powerful jet engines in the world. Stalin is stated to have said, "What fool will sell us his secrets?" To his surprise, the British actually agreed to give the Soviet Union roughly 50 examples of the engines, likely given as a mean of good measure from the new British Prime Minister, who was significantly less suspicious of the communist regime than his predecessor had been. The British had, however, stated to the Soviet Union that these engines need not to be used for military purposes, but this request by the British, as you can imagine, was not followed. The Soviet Union almost immediately reverse-engineered the engines and began to test and have aircraft designed and built around them. Ironically, the most military service the engine would see would actually be in the Soviet Union. With the new engine available, the top speeds and overall potential capabilities of aircraft in the Soviet Union were significantly higher, and as such, the Council of Ministers ordered Mikoyan Goebel, a Soviet aviation company who had a history of producing interceptors, to produce an aircraft that would be able to intercept and destroy enemy bombers quickly and effectively in case a war between the Soviets and the Allies would begin. It would be only 5 months when the prototype would make its first flight on December 30th, 1947, under the designation I-310. At the same time, the United States had begun testing their own advanced jet fighter, which in a few years would compete with this aircraft for air superiority in the skies over Korea. Over the next few months, tensions between South and North Korea began to rise as both sides started to claim sovereignty over the entire Korean peninsula. At the same time, the I-310 continued to be tested, with 2 more prototypes being built and flown, with the first production model, now designated MiG-15, flying for the first time on the last day of 1948. Soon afterwards, it would begin to enter full service with the VBS, or Soviet Air Force, and the VPVO, or Soviet Air Defense Force. During the Soviet May Day parade in 1949, the MiG-15 would be shown to the world when over 40 MiG-15s flew at top speed over Moscow, showing to the world their existence and earning full attention from the United States, just as their own advanced jet fighter, comparable to the MiG-15, entered service a few months prior. At the same time, the MiG-15 started to gain attention from all of NATO, with NATO giving it the designation faggot, a term meaning a bundle of sticks for burning. Now let me just explain this really fast. Since NATO had come into existence and the potential for a conflict between itself and the Soviet Union began to rise, they had begun giving all Soviet aircraft designations similar to their purpose, as this was usually much easier than saying the sometimes complex or completely unknown production names of aircraft, much like the United States had done with Japanese aircraft in the Second World War. The designation faggot was given because all fighters received a name that began with F, and that was at the time demeaning, however not in the same way it is sometimes used today. When the North Koreans finally attacked the South in the summer of 1950, the Soviet government agreed to supply both North Korea and China with MiG-15s, as well as train those who would be piloting them. This, however, would be a significant issue due to the language barrier between the two nations, and severely hampered the training the Korean and Chinese pilots would receive. In October of the same year, Stalin will agree to send MiG-15s secretly flown by Soviets in order to defend the Chinese People's Volunteer Army as they push into Korea. On November 1st, MiG-15 squadrons, piloted by Soviets, would begin flying defensive patrols in North Korea in order to counter United States aircraft which had begun strategic bombing of North Korean military positions. A week later, the United States would send F-86 Sabres to counter the MiG. The first jet-on-jet encounter would occur on November 9th when a naval pilot stationed on the USS Philippine Sea, flying an F-9 Panther, would shoot down and kill a Soviet pilot
A few weeks later, a B-29 strategic bomber was attacked and damaged by an aircraft traveling too fast to be identified, with PA jet fighters assigned to guarding the bomber completely unable to catch or even identify the aircraft. At this time, combat between the F-86 and MiG-15 would become more and more common, with the F-86 being comparable to the MiG-15 in that they had surprisingly very similar characteristics despite being built for completely different roles. The winner of an engagement almost always came down to the pilot of superior skill. Over the next few months, MiG-15s would continue to terrorize United States bombers in the sky, able to shoot down the bombers in a single pass. In an engagement known as Black Tuesday in 1951, over 15 MiG-15s intercepted 9 B-29s and either shot down or damaged around pair 8 of the 9 of them. Following this engagement, all future bomb missions by the United States would be done at night. During the day, however, MiG-15s would continue to engage with the United States Air Force over North Korea, particularly with F-86 Sabres over an area north of the nation, which saw high traffic of Soviet and Chinese pilots flying in and out, known as MiG-Alley. One of the biggest problems faced by MiG pilots during the war was that they were ordered not to fly over enemy lines for the fear of them being shot down and having their planes captured. In fact, in one instance, a MiG-15 pilot was forced to eject from this plane and ended up landing completely surrounded by US troops. Other than being captured and interrogated, however, he chose to commit suicide. Throughout the rest of the war, the planes would continue to fight for aerial supremacy. In the end, the United States came out as the winner in terms of a total victory to loss ratio against the MiG, which is still a debated topic amongst historians as both sides had completely different figures. Overall, the most likely ratio was 8 to 1 against the MiG-15. However, this was mostly against the poorly trained North Korean and Chinese pilots, which make up the majority of the pilots. However, when against the well-trained elite squadrons of the Soviet Union made up of mostly World War II veterans, this ratio is much closer to 1, roughly 1.4 to 1. Late in the war, the United States would drop leaflets in which they were offering $100,000 in citizenship to any pilot who would defect to the south of the MiG. Shortly after the ceasefire that ended the war, a North Korean lieutenant named No Kum-sok would take up that offer and fly his aircraft over the DMZ. He would then land on a United States airsfield just as a fighter was landing on the other side. Immediately, personnel on the base began to panic, with some believing this was the start to another war. No quickly got out of his aircraft, destroyed a photograph of the North Korean dictator, and surrendered. His aircraft would go on to be flown by various test pilots, including the famous Chuck Yeager, and is currently at the National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton, Ohio. No would change his name to Kenneth H. Rowe and currently lives retired in Florida. After the Korean War, the MiG-15 would continue to be used by various nations as a trainer for dozens of years, and saw its last combat missions in 1967 during the Six-Day War. However, at this point, it was extremely outdated and thus suffered horrible losses. Early 1946, Joseph Stalin turned to the Soviet aviation companies and requested a high-altitude bomber interceptor. However, following the first flights of the original Soviet jets, it was clear that with the current engines, this would not be possible, as the engines available simply did not produce enough thrust in order to achieve a high altitude, or enable the plane to carry a heavy enough armament that would be sufficient to bring down a bomber or deal with a heavy fighter if needed. With this realization in mind, the Soviets turned to the British, and surprisingly, the British agreed to give them their impressive new jet engines, which were capable of producing more than enough thrust, roughly 2.5 times different engines, and allowing the Soviets to continue development. After the Soviets acquired the engines, the Council of Ministers gave Mikoyan 5 months in order to design and develop an aircraft that would fit the needs set by Stalin. The project was given the designation I-310. It was decided that the aircraft would be equipped with two 23mm autocannons primarily for aiming and handling fighters, as well as a single 37mm autocannon for delivering the kill against an Allied bomber or an unlucky fighter. Various placements were tested and tried in the first prototype. However, it was finally decided that the guns would be placed on the left and right side of the fuselage of the aircraft directly below the intake. The placement of the guns would remain the same throughout the entire development. After the aircraft began production in late 1948, early 1949 under the production designation MiG-15, the man originally tasked with reverse engineering the British engine continued to develop the engine and created a significant derivative with nearly an additional 1,000 pounds of thrust that would increase the speed of the aircraft even further. Along with the engine and additional improvements that had begun testing on existing MiGs, in the summer of 1949 a new variant was created titled the MiG-15 Bis, Bis being Latin for second. This would be the only significant change to the fighter variant of the MiG-15. However, it would not be the only. A dual-seated trainer aircraft based on the MiG-15, along with a lightly armed reconnaissance variant, would also be tested and used in service by many countries following the Korean War. The MiG-15 was designed following the collapse of Nazi Germany and created a certain respect for the Soviet Union that showed the Western allies that they were not unadvanced and were capable of producing advanced technologies similar to their own.
The biggest problem I faced when creating this video was that the data available was sometimes conflicting at times and required a significant amount of research in order to create with the best possible information. This video was made as a fourth quarter project for an honors history class, and I truly enjoyed researching and learning about this aircraft, as well as gaining knowledge about the ability to create a long, thorough video depicting the history, development, and design of an extremely fascinating aircraft that had a significant effect on the Korean War. Thank you for watching.